I think one of the biggest values is the fact that we now get a chance to reflect on our experiences with Uncle Kathy, but I think probably even more important to reflect on the lessons that we have gotten from being around Uncle Kathy. And the title of this occasion or this program itself, I think, is very fitting, because while a lot of people would have seen this public figure, one of the things that absolutely blew me away by Uncle Kathy every single time I engaged with him was what a multi-dimensional character he was. He was human, he was a person, but I think above everything else, he always tried to live by his core values, and he stuck to them. In everything that he did, all of these core values that we now have tried to keep alive through this organization, he lived them every single day. They shone through in every single conversation he had, in every single activity that he attended, every single rally, every single march, even at protests. At his advanced age, Uncle Kathy was still going to protest for the things that he felt very strongly about. So I think today, as we discover more about this multidimensional life of Uncle Kathy, one of the things that I think we should all think about is what are the lessons that we need to be drawing from this. Without taking up any more of your time, on behalf of the Ahmed Kathrada board, of the foundation's board rather, I'd like to welcome and thank you all of you for joining today. And I really think that after today, we'll all be able to get a much deeper understanding of what an incredible character Uncle Kathy was. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucky. Thank you so much. One of the 5 new young board members that have come on board to ensure that this foundation is transferred to a set of younger board members in the years to come, who will continue this legacy work. To introduce the next presentation, I want to call Annan Singh, somebody that I think Kathy would have seen as his son. Anand provided valuable friendship, camaraderie, and support to Kathy right up until the end. And in particular, Kathy's last visit to Budapest, Barbara was saying to me yesterday, is something that will stick with her. And I'm sure it is something that he remembered up until the end. Anand, thank you so much for doing that interview. We had no sense of what it would be used for at the time, but today we will play short excerpts from it. And thanks to you and Video Vision for the presentation. Over to you to introduce it, and then Zinzi, let us play the presentation as soon as Anand is done. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. It's greetings from early morning in New York, and I'm very honored and thrilled to be with you today. For me, it's a very special day because I've spent many birthdays with Kathy from the time he was released, not only in South Africa, but many countries in the world. And he and I built a friendship, and even when I walk here in New York, and when he was in New York, we were here together. I can tell you many stories, many funny stories about whether it's ice cream or he didn't have a winter coat and it was the middle of winter in New York, and we made jokes about things all through our lives until he left us. But Kathy, as you will hear and have heard already, was a very special individual. And I think all of us were so fortunate to have him in our lives and be a part of our lives. Also, as we are taking on his birthday and dealing with the values that Kathy represented, South Africa is in a sensitive stage. And I think that his ability to be totally open with all his colleagues, with adversaries, and be able to engage even with Madiba when he challenged Madiba as a young youth leader. And that's how that friendship began. And I've been witness to that relationship. So I think obviously we need leaders like Kathy And I think the legacy of Kathy is what we have, and we must look to perpetuate and develop the young leaders that you are already doing at the foundation. You know, as a filmmaker, I was probably for the last 5 years before his death, bugging him to do a one-on-one interview that I would conduct, because I was going to ask him very probing questions, and he was kind of reluctant in the beginning, and then finally in 2015 he was he was coming to Durban, and he said to me, "Okay, well, on this trip he stayed with me, and he said I'll do the interview." And I was very pleased. And what you're going to see is just segments of that interview, which is, I don't think it's been seen by anyone before. So I think it's very fitting to have it presented today on his birthday celebration. And I'm very happy to see that Barbara is on with us. And Barbara, I think a special acknowledgement to you for the role that you have played in making Kathy's life so enjoyable, especially in the latter years. So thank you all. The video can speak for itself. I think he didn't dodge any questions like we see many politicians do. He was very open. So let the video roll, and thanks everybody for participating.
I was lucky enough to be among the real celebrities. I happened to be among them by accident. So I got into the picture that way. Well, as I've had to answer this question, it will be arrogant of me to try to advise them. I can only speak about our own experiences. And in our case, in my case, the discipline already started once I left home at the age of 8 to my aunt's place, who was a strict disciplinarian. Although she was overwhelmingly Muslim, but still the discipline was there, and one had to abide by that. There was a young Kachalia chap, then nephew of Yusuf and Maulvi Kachalia, who was with us at school. And after school hours, we used to go there. And that's where I met with Yusuf and Maulvi Kachalia. And Yusuf took me around, as a youngster, took me around to lectures and so forth. And I credit him with my first introduction to, even before I joined the Young Communist League. As young people, you get attracted to films and lectures and so forth, particularly films, picnics. So the Young Communist League had this club in Fortsburg. And through the club, at the age of 12, I joined the Young Communist League and got involved in so-called politics at that age. So meeting with people like Walter, Madiba. When I was in Matric, I met Madiba for the first time because his fellow student was Ismail Mir. So they now and then used to come along after lectures, law lectures, and by that time I knew Ismail quite well, and subsequently I occupied the very flat when he left, flat 13. But I got used to visiting Ismail. And then when he came along from law lectures with Madiba, that's when I first met him. And then that must have been sometime in 46 already. Also in the 40s, I won't be surprised if I met him before I met Madiba. Simply because he had a little office in Commissioner Street. He was an estate agent. But that office happened to be very near Yusuf Kochalia. And it, again, I'm just maybe guessing, but it's through him that I met Walter before I met Madiba. I have always put them in my, what I consider to be my A team. So it's something that one aspires to, but remain my A team. Madibas, Walter, Moses Kotani, Bram Fisher, those are my A team of political leaders. My first experience was the Ghetto Act. You know, in those years you had different laws applying to different groups. So you had this particular thing called the Asiatic Land Tenure and Indian Representation Act, 1946, which applied only to the Indians. And of course, by that time, I had already been in the YCL for some years. So that's the time when and of course by 45, 46, the whole leadership of the Indian Congresses changed. From a leadership which believed in the politics of negotiation, petitions, deputations, from that to a policy of passive resistance. So that came about in 1945 in Natal, 46 in the Transvaal, when the so-called radical leadership under Dr. Naika in Natal Indian Congress in 45, and Transvaal Indian Congress in 46, where there was a change from the conservative leadership to a radical leadership under the leadership of Dr. Naika and Dr. Dadu. So there was this Doctors' Pact. Dr. Kumar from the African National Congress, Dr. Naika and Dr. Dadu from the Indian Congress. 1947, they signed the Doctors' Pact of Unity as fellow oppressed people. And that was the foundation of a united front against apartheid laws. Just increasing solidarity. In South Africa, even the government has, or the ANC has pledged its support, but it needs much more than that. But fortunately, I believe that in Europe, there's an increasing movement in support of the Palestinian people, including some Western governments, I believe. I've got my own views which I won't express in public. Look, I'm concerned about some of the things. By and large, I think we are doing well. 20 years after democracy, we are doing well. But unfortunately, there are shortcomings at some leadership level. And I can't generalize, and I don't want to start identifying people. But there are allegations. Allegations are like corruption and so forth, which are being made. It's unfortunate, but hopefully it's a passing phase. That has not disturbed in any radical way our road to a full-fledged democracy. It hasn't, in spite of the negative things that are happening and being publicized. I think we are still well on the road to a strong, peaceful democracy. And the policy of the ANC and the policy of the government remains firm. A non-racial, non-sexist, democratic South Africa with emphasis on the neediest of the needy, attending to them. I'd be worried when policy changes, and not to start blaming individuals. Individuals come and go. It's when policy changes that I start worrying. Julius Malema has got a lot of quality in him. I wouldn't condemn him. I wouldn't criticize him. I'd say I'd be concerned. I am concerned at some of the methods he's using, which is not necessary in a democratic society. He's got all the means to express his view and the views of his organizations without causing any disruption in the process. I'd wish, and as I say, I won't condemn him, I'd wish that he'd realize that he is not in the only opposition. There are oppositions which are stronger than him, and they are fully utilizing the democratic process.
What do you think of Muzi Maiman?
No, I think he is a voice that is very, very rational, and a voice that should not be just ignored. I'm not for a moment saying that I'm now turning against the ruling party, but at the same time, there are instances, for instance, in the Cape, in the Western Cape, where they are in the majority, the Democratic Alliance, and their voice just can't be ignored. It is one can't now wish them away, and one can't just paint them the same paint brush as all the opposition parties. It's a party which may have quite a future. I'm not for a moment thinking that within the near future they're going to be so powerful as to through the electoral process overthrow the ANC strength. But I'm not disputing that either, that over the years to come it may happen. But from my own point of view, I don't think it's going to happen in a hurry. Emphasizing their main function, which is to broaden non-racialism. And they are making steady progress, reaching out to particularly young people, schools, universities, and so forth. And there is a youth wing. You know, young people, with due respect, have very little idea of the past, how freedom was arrived at, what was entailed before we got to this day. So that type of message we try to convey to the younger people, that with freedom comes responsibility to themselves, to their parents, to their country. One can't just dismiss weaknesses that one has in one's thinking and in practice. And I need that stability, which I've got from a person like Barbara. When one tends to do something wrong, we've always got in mind that as Barbara is there. So that is very, very, I'm blessed with that I have her in my life.
Do you ever think about death?
Death? Not really. It hasn't occurred yet. Fortunately, I've been blessed, and I think jail had a part in it. With good health, I go for an annual checkup, so nothing has gone worse. It's the usual thing that Indians suffer from is cholesterol. Mine is within control. Yet the doctors have given me something just to keep it at a low level. apart from non-racialism, it is the majority of the population of this country is young. And the future belongs to young people. So with freedom comes responsibility to themselves, to their parents, to their country. Responsibility is on their shoulders to make of South Africa what they themselves want it to be. Successful, healthy, happy country. And that is their responsibility. So while you are taking full advantage of everything that is now opened up, and if you can take full advantage of that, do so. But never forget your responsibilities as young people. And I have no reason to believe that there's going to be any defiance or moving away substantially from the policy of one non-racial, non-sexist, democratic South Africa. Thanks. Okay, I'll have another drink.
Well, thanks, Anand. Thanks for your vision. And I suppose it was just wonderful seeing and hearing Kathy again. I'm hoping, Anand, we will think about how to put out the entire interview at some point in a way that which this shorter version was done as well. Kathrada's involvement in the 1956 Women's March is what Auntie Sophie will talk about. Auntie Sophie has also recently established the Sophie and Henry Williams de Bruin Foundation, which is looking at the kind of legacy work around her and her husband, as well as around issues that take forward her own sets of values and issues that she has been championing. Auntie Sophie, over to you in the next 10 minutes. Talk to us about your comrade and friend Ahmed Kathrada and his work behind the scenes in the 1956 Women's March. Auntie Sophie. Is Auntie Sophie there? No. Can we try once more, Auntie Sophie? Okay. Can we just try and get Auntie Sophie there? If not, in 1951, Ahmed Kathrada went to Europe for the youth festival, but eventually took up a post at the World Federation for Democratic Youth. Auntie Sophie, I see you now. Are you going to come in?
Okay, are you able to see me now?
We can't see you, but we can hear you. There we are. Over to you, Auntie Sophie.
Thank you, Comrade Sean. And thank you for inviting me here today. And good afternoon to all the participants. Yes, it is a very special day for me as well. And my humble contribution today is really twofold. In reflecting a little bit on the role Comrade Kathy played in support and strength and the care he gave to women on so many levels of our struggle in their quest for the emancipation of women. Over the many decades of his life, And it is also in remembrance of the many brave and fiercely committed women of fortitude. They are all now in another realm, like Comrade Cassie, and also the many current mixed generation of women are continuing in the footsteps of the women of fortitude. I first met Comrade Cassie at a fundraising party in a house in Ann Street in Doornfontein, which is here in Johannesburg. And that was during the 50s. And this was a fundraising which I don't remember who the recipients of that funds was, but I was told it was for a good cause. It was also during my appointment as organizer of the South African Congress, Other People's Congress, SAPCO. When I started my duties at the headquarters of the Joint Congress movement that was situated in opposite Market Street, opposite Comrade Cassie's flat at Colbert House. And that is where I frequented, that is where I had frequent contact with Comrade Cassie and also learned to know him better. His leadership qualities was admirable, and he was focus-driven and hardworking and untiring. He was also kind and would go that extra mile, refusing to put off until tomorrow what can be done today. He was someone that spoke his mind and was unyielding on core principles, which is why he thought deeply about the precarious state of our country. And he wrote to the former president to resign. That was the caliber of Comrade Cassie. But working under his guidance as young activists, together with Comrade Mozi Mullah, late Comrade Rosie Matthews, Farid Adams, Alan Lambert, Abdullah Jessup, to name a few, was very educated both politically and also administratively. His work ethic was unquestionable. And although he was strict, he was understanding, fair and kind in many respects. And I can recall at the coming towards the end of my first year at the Congress offices where I was, what they call today deployed. As it neared to Christmas, I became very emotional and withdrawn because I was longing for my family, knowing that I wouldn't be able to see them during Christmas because those days we were not earning a salary. All of us, we were given money whenever there was money. And Comrade Cassie came to me and noticed, as he noticed, he came to me and wanted to know what was worrying me. And I didn't tell him, I made excuses. And the following day, he asked me again, and I burst out crying and telling him that I long my family, it's now Christmas and I'm not able to go home because I don't have train fare and so on. So he left me like that. And later in the day, he came and handed me some money, telling me that this is enough money for you and Comrade Rosie, because she was also from PE. And the two of you must buy tickets and go home for holidays. So that was his generosity and his kindness and caring nature, not only to me, but to all those that were in need of one thing or another that they were short of. Comrade Kathy's attributes were seen as crucial to the Indian Congress and the Indian Youth Congress. And he served on several senior positions and structures in the Congress movement. He was appointed secretary of the Indian High School, where he assisted the Indian Parents Association to set up the Indian High School in Johannesburg. When the Indian schools were closed down by the apartheid regime, forcing children to attend schools, which was 22 miles away from Johannesburg, to Asia at the time. He organized Ray Duma Nokwe and Sheila Morrison and Comrade Musaji to teach at the high school. These were comrades who had degrees in education. And they were the ones who taught at the high school in Johannesburg, among other teachers. And he remained the secretary of the high school. And I think it was Comrade Esop and his brother Aziz that attended that school. But Comrade Kathy also had remarkable organizing skills and foresight, and his foresight was greatly appreciated by the Federation of South African Women, especially when a large number of women traveled from their areas and districts of Transvaal, around Transvaal and other areas, and they descended in Johannesburg unexpectedly on the eve of the 9th of August and made their way to Congress headquarters to continue their journey to Pretoria the following day. Fortunately, the basement of the Congress offices was spacious and accommodation was organized for them. Some of the women that couldn't be housed in the basement offices, Comrade Kathy made his flat 13 at Colbert House available for some of them to stay the night over. And this he generally did, which was another quality of his caring nature. He was known to give up his bed or his bedroom when comrades came from outlying areas in Transvaal, not having a place to sleep. Colbert House was conveniently centrally situated as they alighted from Park Station, finding it much easier to overnight at Kathy's flat than to take the arduous and sometimes dangerous journey to the townships. And now in the cases In the case of the unexpected arrival of women, we contacted some of the Indian Congress Youth League and directed them to organize and collect blankets and foodstuff from the Indian merchants around the Market Street precinct for the guests, and he made sure that they were fed and settled in as comfortable as possible. As in every aspect of our liberation struggle, Comrade Kathy found it necessary in defeating the apartheid state. And so too did he demonstrate that kind of courage and determination with the Women Protest March, with the women protest and march to the Union buildings against passes. And despite Kathy's banning order, which disallowed him from leaving the magisterial district of Johannesburg, he drove a number of Indian women to Pretoria. And such as Comrade Amina Pawar and others to participate in the protest march. And after they alighted from the vehicle that Comrade Kathy drove, he discreetly stayed to make sure that they were safe to assemble with a large crowd that had gathered at the foot of the Union buildings since dawn. Although he was aware that the special branch was also lurking around the Union buildings, he was careful not to be spotted. So here at this virtual gathering today, we pay tribute to him, and it is only right and proper that we recommit ourselves to an outstanding icon, a patriot, a friend, a comrade, and a leader who displayed throughout his entire life the true values of servant leadership. This indomitable spirit inspires us to assess ourselves and to emulate his life in order to overcome the wretchedness that has befallen our country. And as we continue to observe Women's Month, we thank him for his lifelong hard work and immense sacrifice. Long live Comrade Kathy's undefeatable spirit, long live. Malibongwe, Gama Lama Kosikasi, Malibongwe, and thank you very much.
No, thank you, Auntie Sophie. Thank you immensely for your powerful words, for the remembrance and the tribute. We are so happy that your foundation has taken off, and we have pledged to collaborate and support it in whatever way is necessary. And we hope that at some point, the life of Sophie Williams, the brain, will see some kind of end product, some book or some publication, because that is a story that needs to be told. Ahmed Kathrada's stay in Europe, 1951, altered his life in many ways. His first-hand experience of the aftermath of the Second World War and of the Holocaust, I think shaped his understanding of what racism could end up in, and made his determination to fight it much, much more greater. so much so that he cut short his visit there to come back to be part of the 1952 Defiance campaign. It's not a part of his life that we knew too much about. Fortunately, Dr. Ronnie Michael, from a postdoctoral fellow at the World Holocaust Remembrance Center, did some work on this, has written 2 very useful papers on Kathrada and that period, but also on other aspects of his life on Robben Island, and the work of Anne Frank and his relationship with that particular book, and how it shaped his kind of understanding of the Holocaust and its impact, and the issue of sacrifice and resistance. We have a recorded presentation from Ronnie, although she is online, but is driving at the moment, but sent us this recording. We've also posted the paper in the chat for those of you who want to go through it at some point. But before we start, let me acknowledge Barbara Hogan, but also a couple of special friends of the foundation: Kurt Dewast in the US, Nadira Umarji in Amsterdam, Ismail Hussein in Australia, the Kathrada family who are here as well. Your presence means just a huge amount for us here today. Let's get the presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I would like to open by extending my gratitude for the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation for inviting me to participate in this moving event, and to apologize for not being there live. My lecture today is based on parts of my PhD dissertation, Remembering the Holocaust in a Racial State, written under the supervision of Professor Louise Bethlehem and Professor Amos Goldberg at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. It focuses on Ahmed Kathrada and his evolving perceptions and reflections on the Holocaust during the apartheid years. On the morning of October 15, 1989, Ahmed Kathrada was released from Pollsmoor Maximum Security Prison near Cape Town. A South African Indian veteran of the anti-apartheid struggle, treason trialist, and long-serving political prisoner, Kathrada had spent 26 years and 3 months in prison, 18 years of which were on Robben Island. Leaving his prison cell, Kathrada carried with him some cardboard boxes containing his most prized belongings. This included 900 carbon copies of letters he had written and an equivalent number of letters he had received. There were also 7 notebooks in which Kathrada had secretly recorded inspiring passages he had encountered over the years. In his 3rd notebook, Kathrada recorded 13 entries from the diary of Anne Frank, which was smuggled onto Robben Island in the late 60s. On November 2014, I visited the University of Western Cape, Robben Island Mayabuye archives, and located Kathrada's prison notebooks. 2 years later, in 2016, I ran into a Facebook post of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center to mark International Refugee Day. With a photo of Kathrada, I immediately wrote to Tali Nates, the director of the center, and asked for a direct connection to Kathrada. It was through Tali and the center's connection with the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation that eventually, in August 2016, I had the privilege to interview Ahmed Kathrada in his apartment in Johannesburg. While I read Kathrada's memoirs several times, it was a true honor to meet him in person and to hear his life story firsthand. 6 months later, on March 28, 2017, he passed away at the age of 87, leaving us with a remarkable life story which continue to enrich the categories through which we imagine social justice. Kathrada's interest in the Jewish genocide did not start with the reading of the diary of Anne Frank on Robben Island. In fact, his life history included, among other things, a visit he made to the Auschwitz concentration camp and to the Warsaw Ghetto in Poland in 1951. It is through the similarities that Kathrada drew between his struggle and the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, and later between his personal imprisonment and Anne's imprisoned in hiding, that a productive interaction between Holocaust memory and his own experiences in apartheid South Africa is revealed. Today, I will give you a short glimpse into his visit to post-war Europe and his encounters between the history of the Holocaust and his own traumatic experiences of racism and apartheid. So, as you all know, Kathrada was born on August 21st, 1929 in Zreterenek, a small rural town about 2,040 miles from Johannesburg, to a religious Muslim family of Indian descent. And at the time, stereotypes of the Indian merchant as dishonest, crafty, and exploitive were prevalent in the South African society from the very inception of Indian settlement in the country in 1860. Although anti-Indian legislation had been imposed upon Indians at a regular interval since the late 19th century, the rise of Afrikaner right-wing proto-fascist organizations over the 30s and the 40s provoked violent anti-Indian demonstrations across the country. While Kathrada describes his childhood in Zreterenek as marked by joy, he was eventually forced to leave his own hometown when he was 8 years old and moved to Johannesburg, as the local segregation determined separate schools for separate races, and as in Zreterenek, there was a school for whites and a school for Black South Africans, but no school for Indians. In 1939, when South African Parliament decided to enter the Second World War on the side of the Allies, it also introduced the Asian Land Tenure and Trading Act, placing further restrictions on Indian residents. This resulted in a new Indian leadership evolving from the left, which was drawn to the Communist Party of South Africa, and the Indian South African activist Joseph Dadu was one of the first Indian leaders to join the Communist Party in early 1939. Following Dadu, Kathrada was drawn into the Young Communist League when he was only 12 years old, and by the mid-40s, he was already well invested in communism and was admitted into the South African Communist Party. As Kathrada told me in his interview, it was in the party meetings that he first acquired deeper knowledge of Nazi Germany and the ongoing tragedy of European Jewry. Kathrada's account regarding the fact that in the Communist Party, he heard lectures about Nazism and about the ghettos and the Jewish suffering during the Holocaust is compatible with the scholarly historiographic portrayal of the Communist Party of South Africa's position on the war. Until June 1941, the South African Communist Party rejected the war, claiming it was an inter-imperialist conflict and focused on building a united front against the war that included the white and Black working class. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed by the Soviets and the Germans in 1939, helped reinforce this stance. However, immediately after Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union on June 21st, 1941, the party shifted position and became a staunch defender of human liberty in the face of Nazi terror. Indeed, Kathrada testified that the Communist Party's anti-fascist message had a great impact on him, especially in light of the right-wing Afrikaner support for Nazism at the time. Moreover, he asserted that the sites of war he witnessed 10 years later during his European Odyssey reinforced his anti-fascist tendencies. On 14 June 1951, Kathrada left South Africa to serve as the head of the Africa desk at the World Federation of Democratic Youth headquarters in Budapest. During his visit abroad, he traveled through the Czech Republic to Germany and Poland, where he witnessed firsthand the destruction left by the Second World War. While there is much to say about Kathrada's visit in Europe, particularly in Germany and Czechoslovakia, due to time restraints, I would like to focus now on his visit to Poland in September 1951. He was invited to participate in the Warsaw meeting of the International Union of Students and traveled the city and its surroundings in the weeks prior to the event. It was during that short period that he visited the Warsaw Ghetto and Auschwitz concentration camp. In his memoirs, he reflects on the enormous impact of the sites he had witnessed. And he states, and I quote, "When we went to what had been the Warsaw Ghetto, I was reminded of the Nazi atrocities in Czechoslovakia. The Jews who rose up in Warsaw had been crushed as ruthlessly as the villagers of Lidis, confined to an area of the city behind a wall 18 kilometers long and almost 3 meters high. The Jews had been warned by one of the rare escapees from Treblinka that extermination waited at the end of a nightmarish rail journey in closed cattle cars. Led by Mordechai Anilevich, the young and the brave rose up against their capture on 19 April 1943. By 8 May, the uprising had been crushed, and rather than be taken prisoner, Anilevich and others took their own life. When I visited the site of this blot on humanity, only a modest monument marked the murder of tens of thousands of Jews and paid tribute to the hundreds who fought back and died. Kathrada's encounter with the remains of the Warsaw Ghetto in 1951 and his detailed description of the Jewish uprising points to his perception of the Jewish tragedy in Europe as a point of inspiration. While Kathrada's memoirs specifically describe the Warsaw Ghetto victim as Jews, he also recognized the non-Jewish victims of Nazi atrocities, aka the Lidis massacre victims, whom he positions as central to his recollection of his visit to Prague. And we will not be able to elaborate on this one today. But Kathrada points to similarities between the story of the crushed resistance of the Warsaw Ghetto Jews and the story of the persecution and massacre of the inhabitants of Lidis. For him, emphasizing the stories of heroic resistance to the Nazis expresses his universal perception of the cost of the war, although this universal perception depends to a large extent on the particular. By recognizing the specifically Jewish identity of the victims of the Warsaw Ghetto, but by positioning their heroic resistance and tragic death alongside those of the victims of Lidis, Kathrada retains some elements of the Soviet narrative of the war, but abandons others in order to reflect on the struggle in South Africa. Kathrada testified that his visit to the Auschwitz concentration camp was an experience that made an indelible impression on him. And it is important to know that in 1947, the Polish government declared Auschwitz-Birkenau a memorial site at which Poles and citizens of other nationalities fought and died a martyr's death. The International Auschwitz Committee, comprised of survivors and relatives of victims, was dominated by veterans of the largely communist Auschwitz underground. And this committee dedicated the barracks in the original war camp to 20 countries for use as national pavilions. One of these structures became a Jewish pavilion that was usually locked and open only on special occasions. And Auschwitz was exhibited as a site of the Nazi terror and international martyrdom. However, it was not depicted as a Jewish site, and as the Jewish extermination was forced into the background, the extent of Polish suffering, as well as the role of the heroic liberating Red Army, was foregrounded. And Kathrada writes on Auschwitz, and I quote, "I could never obliterate the sites of the trench in which dogs mauled and savaged people to death, the gas chambers, the incinerators, the lampshades made of human skin, the pillows stuffed with human hair." He found Auschwitz to be a poignant reminder to mankind of the evils of racism, and was overcome with emotion as he walked on the fragments of human bones littering the street near the incinerators. Kathrada believed that the Jewish genocide constituted an important lesson for humanity and bore particular relevance for his own country. Thus, he carefully collected a handful of bone fragments, bringing them back to South Africa to serve as stark reminder of racism's consequences. In an ironic twist, the South African police discovered these bones during a raid on Kathrada's flat a few years later. When Kathrada explained their provenance, one of the policemen remarked that they were probably just Jews. Although Kathrada wrote his memoirs decades after his European Odyssey, his description of these experiences in 1951 remains deeply emotional. Collecting bones of fragments from Auschwitz, this reminder of the consequences of racism brought home to Kathrada the parallels between the Holocaust and possible future consequences of apartheid in South Africa. Kathrada returned to South Africa in May 1952, determined to participate actively in the struggle against apartheid. On a winter morning in September 1952, he stood on the podium at a trade hall in Johannesburg, holding a bottle full of human bones he had collected in Auschwitz, and addressed the audience of the African National Congress Youth League. And he stated, and I quote, "People are fighting for freedom in the whole world. I was in Europe a few months ago, and there saw a number of human bones laying about the country, bones of Jews that Hitler killed because he accused them of being communists. They were not communists. Malan is now following the example of Hitler by arresting our leaders." End of quote. This speech, delivered only a few months after Kathrada's return from Europe, provides an accurate and contemporaneous indication of his perception of the Holocaust. On the one hand, he specifically refers to the Jews as Hitler's victim. Simultaneously, however, in noting that Hitler accused the Jews of being communists, Kathrada departs from the Jewish narrative of the Holocaust. While the Jewish narrative places anti-Semitism at the center of the Nazi ideology, Kathrada's observation implies that Nazi ideology was motivated by anti-communism, a position more compatible with the Soviet narrative of the war. Moreover, by stating that the Jews were not communists, Kathrada emphasizes that Hitler's Nazism enlisted communism as a means for the elimination of the Jewish people during the Holocaust. As we shall see below, in other addresses made by Kathrada during the 50s, this accusation enabled him to draw parallels between Hitler and Malan's policy of invoking the struggle against communism in order to suppress its opposition. And of course, in an address he made to the Anti-Permit Committee on November 18, 1956, he continued to draw connections between Hitler and Malan's anti-communist agenda, and he stated, and I quote, "I said to you before that Dr. Malan tried to imprison our leaders under the Suppression of Communism Act. In 1933, Hitler also had the Suppression of Communism Act in Germany. It was an act to suppress communism. It was an act which killed millions and millions of innocent people who fought for freedom. And in this statement, Kathrada repeats his claim that the Third Reich's suppression of Communism Act was Hitler's means of executing millions of people. He neglects to designate the victims' specifically Jewish identity. However, his comparison between the Nazi Enabling Act of March 1933, which allowed the Nazis to effectively determine who was an opponent, and the Apartheid Suppression of Communism Act of 1950 is not inaccurate. According to statistics held by the Nazis, the most common form of opposition to Nazism came from those ideologically opposed to Nazism, primarily the communists and socialists. As in the South African case, once one was labeled as an opponent of the government, arrest was inevitable. In October 1989, as I stated, just after Kathrada was released from prison, he delivered a public speech at Soccer City, where he noted, and I quote, in 1962, in my last public speech before being placed under house arrest and subsequently sentenced in the Rivonia trial, I showed to the gathering of Wits University students a handful of bones that I had brought back from the Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland. These were remains of human beings, innocent Jewish people who had been gassed to death for the mere fact that they were Jews. Their bodies were burnt in incinerators and the bones were thrown on the streets of the camp. I brought back these bones as a constant reminder to myself and to my fellow South Africans of the evils of racialism, which dominated every aspect of South African life. As this speech demonstrates, Kathrada perceived the human bones brought to South Africa from Auschwitz as bones of innocent Jews who had been gassed to death for the mere fact that they were Jews. This bone serves as a material reminder of the horrors of the Jewish genocide. The speech serves as yet another indicator of Kathrada's embracing of the Jewish tragedy in an effort to promote non-racialism in South Africa. As Kathrada's European Odyssey in 1951 clearly influenced his early struggle against apartheid, it is safe to assume that those early insights also stepped into his experiences and continued struggle on Robben Island, and particularly into his deeply personal reading of the Diary of Anne Frank, which unfortunately I won't be able to speak about today. I would like to thank you all for listening, and please stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronnie. Thank you for that wonderful exposition, and thanks for the research and the 2 papers that you've written. We have shared that, and I'm sure at a later occasion, we will probably be asking you to come and spend a bit more time and dealing with both papers in much more detail. This year being the centenary of the Communist Party, we thought it important to invite the Communist Party to come and talk about Kathrada and his relationships and links and membership of the party itself. And it's always important to bear in mind that when Kathy was arrested at Lily's Leaf, he was there as a full-time organizer or functionary, as he called it, of the Communist Party. It's safe to say that he only became a signed-up member of the ANC after he was released, although he was sentenced as part of an ANC core of people in the Rivonia trial. But to reflect on Kathy and the Communist Party in the year of its centenary, the party has asked Ronnie Kesros to speak on its behalf today. And it's always a pleasure to have Ronnie here who needs no introduction from me. Comrade Ronnie, over to you. The next 10 minutes is yours. Can we get Ronnie Casrels?
Yeah.
Okay, there you are.
Fine. So thanks very much for...
You're not too clear. We can't hear you too clearly.
Yeah, okay. Now you can hear me.
Yes, yes.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you. And I bring to this event the greetings from the South African Communist Party, of course, in its centenary. And Comrade Kathy was born simply 8 years after the party's foundation. It puts him in touching distance of the founders of the Communist Party. And given his closeness and then membership of the ANC, we're talking of a giant of our struggle who was born just 27 years after the ANC was founded. I think there's something to reflect on this because of the proximity of Kathy, who was actually a younger man than the Mandelas and the Sisulus, a good decade older than him. He was really one of that A-team, a very modest comrade and human being, talked about an A-team as though he didn't belong to it. We heard this in the lovely video that Annan Singh has produced. So Ahmed Kathrada has those roots and the links with both objective conditions in South Africa, that's the socio-economic, cultural, material, psychological basis of our country, its power relationships, its colonialism, the dual oppression, as we thought then, it's actually treble, of race and class, and of course, gender. The race factor is very important. As I was listening to the previous speaker, the first time I met Comrade Kathy, informally, we weren't introduced as Communist Party members. I was just a couple of years into my 20s, and he was in Durban. I had been recruited into the Communist Party and into MK. I'm talking here about 1962. And my mentor and the person who recruited me was MP Naika, great friend of Comrade Kathy's, and of course, the leading communist in the then Natal. I'd been fired from work with Lever Brothers. I'd been arrested there and dragged off to the Transkei to face a trial. I was out on bail and I was fired, and doing a bit of work with MP. And there was a little bit of a problem because the party unit that I was in, it had a very dominant, rather iconic member of the party who had been in the party for a long time. And it was becoming somewhat of a Maoist, which was confusing me, but I could confide in Comrade MP. And I was really taken up with what was being preached, that our movement needed to come out on class issues, on anti-imperialism much more vociferously. And MP took advantage of the fact that Comrade Kathy, who was regarded, by the way, as one of the most radical people in the movement, was down in KZN or Natal, and they were going to take a tour of the province for a week, meeting various figureheads, Harry Gwala, Comrade Motana, and so on, from Maritzburg to Ladysmith and other places up the coast. And MP said to me, I want you to come along. It's giving you a chance to engage with Kathrada. And I also want to introduce you around to people in the province who are connected with us as a movement and who we raise funds from. It was clear that Kathy was also out to raise funds for the movement as such. What I want to say is that I had the privilege, and we're talking about Kathrada in 1962. He's not that old. I'm 22 and he's something like, what would have that been, 34 or so. Here is the guy I was told was a radical. And, you know, he came across the way we know Kathy and the way we've seen him in the video today. Very sober, very balanced, level-headed, and a person who was sitting in the front of the vehicle with MP, and I was in the back. They interacted. He gave a lot of time to me. I want to say to the previous speaker, one of the first things he said to me was, "Oh, you must be Jewish." And, you know, I was anti-religion and so on. And I said, yes. And where are your folks from? I told him Lithuania. And he began to tell me about the suffering, what the Holocaust was. I knew about it in broad brushstrokes, but not to the way that he conveyed it. And then he said to me, look, as a Jew, and you've clearly become involved in the liberation movement, South Africa is your country. Don't ever think that it was only Jews who perished in that Holocaust. It was Christians, it was socialists, it was communists, it was Roma people. We used the term gypsy in those days, homosexuals and so on. He wanted me to understand that. What I want to say to you, Comrade Shah, and it comes to the party and its role, that what he discussed with me, because MP had clearly briefed him on some of the contradictions in my party unit and some of the questions I was raising. And what he did was give a really very balanced analysis of what the Communist Party had pioneered. The characterization of South Africa as colonialism of special type. The fact of the struggle against racial domination for national liberation, side by side with the emancipation of labor, and the question of women was dealt with, and I wouldn't say as deeply as later, but he showed a sensitivity. And Comrade Sophie, I want to tell you, he told me about the March of the Women in 57, and he made it clear to me, and this comes out in Annet's presentation, of really the fact that we had to unite the country in a broad-based way in terms of class, in terms of race, in terms of religion, in terms of gender. And this was a communist speaking. It made a huge impression on me. It was unique because that was the longest period in time that I ever had the privilege of being with Comrade Kathy. It was a whole week. We slept under the same roof during that week around the province. And of course, this wasn't the way things were post-1990 and so on, where we met on a perfunctory basis. So, Comrade Chan, I've got a clock here and I see I'm just hitting 10 minutes. I want to end by saying, in terms of the Communist Party and the way we're viewing things, and how Comrade Kathy, who is very much alive in our mind, our memory, on video, film, and so on, and in his writings, how would he have been looking at the recent turmoil that has been faced in our country and how it should be dealt with? He would be absolutely, as we are, as outraged. I think he would have been a bit more outraged about the Zuma years than he was in Annan's interview on video, which after all, I think, Annan, that must have been about 2014. And there was a need for somewhat discretion then. Things became much worse then, after that. And of course, in terms of what was unleashed recently by the acolytes and the grouping around Zuma, the demagogy, the racism, we see what's happening in KZN at present. And the fact that there was clearly an attempt to destabilize the country. he would be absolutely strong in the denunciation. He would be calling for exposure, for dealing with those people who instigated this violence. And further, he would be reminding us, Comrade Nishan and comrades there today, that the kindling, the combustibility for the fire that broke loose, that these opportunists were able to use, was the fact that 2 decades plus since freedom, we still have this enormous gap and gulf between wealth and poverty, the unemployment, the frustration, all the problems of our economy, which if we are going to prevent this kind of outbreak in future, we have to deal firmly with such demagogues and incendiarists. But we have to turn a corner in terms of our economy and find a different approach, one in which we keep strictly on terms with the unity with an ANC, with, as the party has made clear in its recent statement, the rejuvenation of the ANC, the saving of the alliance, the dealing with the corruption, the getting us back on track for the values of Kathy, of Ahmed Kathrada and his fellows, men and women of his golden age. This is the legacy, comrades. This is what we must understand and reflect on. So that's the message, and thank you very much for having us present. Long live the memory of Comrade Kathy.
Always great to have you, Comrade Ronnie. 2013 saw Ahmed Kathrada going to Palestine for the first and only time in his life. But he went there at the invitation of the following speaker, Majid Bamia. Majid is the political coordinator, legal advisor, and the first counselor at the mission of the State of Palestine to the UN. He's a diplomat there. And Majid will talk about what transpired from that visit and subsequent to it. Majid, over to you. The next 10 minutes is yours.
Thank you, dear Chan, and thank you and to the Kathrada Foundation for this invitation to speak of one of my personal heroes and a great friend to Palestine. And you know, the ties between Palestine and South Africa and our peoples have been forged in struggle. These are the closest and strongest ties that you can forge. And we did not forget about you while our struggle was ongoing, and you did not forget about us once you had overcome. And Ahmed Kathrada, Uncle Kathy, embodied that strong and historic and continuous bond between our peoples. You know, all oppressors want to demonize the struggle of the oppressed. And one of the ways to do that is to demonize the prisoners. Maybe the best way to do that is to demonize the prisoners and to blame the victim for its own fate and to blame us for being under oppression. And so, you know, we've had endured that campaign for years and decades across the world, and we were fighting back. And we had very successful campaigns, but that were about fragmented issues, administrative prisoners, one of the worst forms of arbitrary detention, women prisoners, children prisoners, members of parliament. At some point, we had 40% of our parliamentarians in prison, and there was a running joke that soon we would have the quorum inside Israeli jails. And the reflection that we were having is, how can we have a campaign about all prisoners, inspired from the Free Mandela campaign? And of course, Marwan Barghouti had a lot of support nationally and internationally. You know, the European Parliament had called for his release, the International Parliamentary Union. And people were saying we should have a Free Marwan Barghouti campaign, and that's it, you know, focusing on one figure. And we wanted to, and he wanted also to have all prisoners, a call for the release of all prisoners. And people were, especially in the West, skeptical, you know, how difficult, and, you know, violence and Israel branding all of these people as terrorists and the backlash. And we knew we could rely on our South African friends because they knew these policies, they knew these practices. You know, when we start explaining, they can finish the sentence for us. And so we asked, who could we invite at a conference that would start these efforts for international campaign. And everybody was answering, Ahmed Kathrada is the person to do that. And we invited him, and you came along, and he was able to see Palestine, to interact with the people, and to show all the things that we've discovered about him, his humanity, his compassion, his solidarity, his leadership. And he stepped up to the plate and he said, we're willing to do anything we can to allow for this campaign for the freedom of Marwan Barghouti and all prisoners, to get the kind of solidarity necessary. And, we understand, and he understands, that freedom is the condition for peace. And it starts with the freedom of the prisoners to allow for the freedom of a nation. And we've had almost 1 million prisoners, since the start of the dispossession of the Palestinian people. And therefore, he invited us to Robben Island 6 months later, and we did what was supposed impossible. We got an international high-level committee and very strong support, former leaders from all continents, now 8 to 9 Nobel Peace Prize laureates supported the campaign. We had support from parliaments around the world. And all of that was made possible by just telling people the obvious. If you were against apartheid and against oppression in South Africa, the same rules apply. If you were for the freedom of Mandela and for the freedom of political prisoners in South Africa, you have to be for the freedom of the Palestinian prisoners. You cannot have these double standards continue. And we believed that that was a winning bet, and it wouldn't have been a winning bet without the personal implication of Kathrada. And he allowed that to happen. And 6 months later, we were on Robben Island launching one of the biggest campaigns in the history of the struggle of the Palestinian people, from the cell of Nelson Mandela, who is a symbol for the entire world, and an icon. Uncle Kathy was the one launching it alongside Fadwa Barghouti, who was the wife of Marwan Barghouti, and in the presence of civil society organizations from Palestine and leaders. And the campaign also enjoyed support from leaders from all political parties in a great sign of unity. And what I want to say about that is that we were extremely touched by how humble he was about the battles he had fought himself, how interested he was to show support and solidarity with the ones that were coming and speaking of their own ordeal. And he was shy about speaking about his own suffering and sacrifice. And warriors are allowed to rest after having fought long battles like he has done. But there are some warriors, like Kathrada, who always ask, what battles remain to be fought? And we are privileged that he decided that Palestine was one of these important and emblematic battles in the fight for freedom and justice. And I also, if you allow me, it's honorable to fight injustice when you are under its assault. It's even more remarkable when, after having done that, you decide to fight injustice that others are enduring. And I can say that we were privileged and lucky to walk a few miles alongside a giant who has fought for the freedom of his people, and who has fought with the same heart and the same passion and the same interest and the same readiness to do anything we ask for when fighting for the freedom of the Palestinian people. And I think I speak on behalf of the Palestinian people as a whole and our prisoners when I say our eternal gratitude to him. And he's a giant, and he asked us to rise up and to rise to the level of the challenges that still lie ahead. Our people are still fighting dispossession, displacement, and denial of rights. And we know we can count on your support and on the solidarity of the South African people in succeeding in that battle. He had wrote at the start of this campaign, apartheid, after being vanquished in South Africa, cannot be allowed to triumph in Palestine, and it shall not, with your support and solidarity and the resilience of our people. And we tell Uncle Kathy he's a Palestinian, we love him, and we wish him to rest in peace and in power. Thank you.
Thanks, Majid. Thank you so much for that. We're getting towards a very important contribution now. Andre Odendaal has just released this particular book, amongst others. And in this book, Andre chronicles the establishment of the Robben Island Museum. And what we've asked Andre to talk about here is the establishment of Robben Island Museum, the work of Ahmed Kathrada in that, and the issues that emanated from the establishment and the operationalizing of the museum, and how some of those issues have grown into the issues of capture and corruption that we've come to see in South Africa today. So Andre, just thank you for being a chronicler of our history and a storyteller, and over to you for the next 20 minutes. Thanks, Andre.
Thank you very much, Sean, and also good afternoon to Barbara, who was shared so much of Kathy's journey, to his family and friends and his comrades, and also especially, as you mentioned, to the young leaders and participants of the foundation, who in these times that we're living through must come forward as the leaders for the future. And it's a privilege for me to speak about this multidimensional, wonderful person that Lucky Nkosi referred to earlier as multidimensional. And the different aspects of his personality and his interests, his wide range. And I was very fortunate to work with him for 10 years in the setting up of Robben Island, in dealing with legacy work. And it's not generally known that from the unbannings in 1990, it was 27 years before Kathy's passing. And in that time, the island and building it into what it should become and what it should represent became a key passion in his life, and also recording the history of both the island and that magnificent liberation struggle that brought us democracy in 1994. The story, as you've said, is told in our new book, Rainbow Dreams, the making of democratic South Africa's first national heritage institution. And I want to also acknowledge my co-editors, Neo Lekgotla Lagaramupi, Nal Solani, and Kwezi Kampumlana, who I think is also on here. We hope that people will look at that fuller story. We can only touch on parts of it. Kathy died on 28th March 2017, aged 89, after 7 decades of struggle for the betterment of humanity. I think is a word that is right if you look at the wide areas of struggle that he was involved in. An activist to the end, as his 150 public events for the foundation in 2016 showed. And the program at the funeral, which in itself became a moment of resistance, marking a political turning point in South African politics, listed some of the achievements of this humble or modest man. Among them, the Freedom of the City Awards of Johannesburg, Cape Town, and London, several honorary doctorates, and the ANC's highest award, the Isitwalandwe or Siaparankwe Award, or the one who wears the plumes of a rare bird, reserved only for the select few. But one particular line caught my eye, for there listed on the page appeared, appointed as Fellow, Maibuye Center, University of the Western Cape, 1991. It was something of a shock to me to see that, and to think that Kathy counted amongst his life's accomplishment this moment, when sitting in an unimpressive empty room at UWC with boxes of unsorted archives around us, he accepted this position with absolutely no benefits. To join me and Peter Williams and Bertie Fritz as the first earliest staff complement of the Maibuye Center. It was such a privilege to work with Kathy, Comrade Kathy, or later simply Uncle Kathy, as this much loved man was called. And working with him was one of the most profound learning experiences in my life. Not only was he one of those revered Rivonia trialists, he was also generous, modest, highly intelligent individual with a lovely sense of humor and, of course, an unimpeachable, principled approach to life. As someone who did not complete school because of politics, he ended up with 3 degrees in prison. He loved history and recounting stories and reading. He took down notes from all the books he read. And his memoirs and letters from prison remain a testament to his values and contribution to South African society. Part of the reason why he became so obsessed almost with history was the many mistakes that academics and historians like me made in the process of writing about the struggle. He recounted to us the story of how the Rivonia trialists once read a piece on the 1960 struggles in which they identified 19 factual errors. And this made for him the telling of the story much more important. So he became an active ambassador for Maibuye. We started from nothing and it ended up being a wonderful archive with energy and dynamism at the time it was founded in straight after the unbannings. And Kathy was so important for us in this. He was always there to talk to. He donated 8,000 pages of material. He helped us collect material from the ANC in exile, which was stored in that famous number 13 Colvard House. And I remember carrying these 13 trunks down into a combi and driving them 1,000 miles to Cape Town with a tremendous sense of privilege. How lucky I was to be observing history, producing history, and participating in small ways in helping to make history during that time. The 90s was a wonderful moment for us. And it was like one could tap and download USB like living stories of the past when you were with him. Through him, you also met remarkable people like, and his most loved friends and comrades like Tata Sisulu and Eddie Daniels, as well as Andimba Toivo Yatoivo, Kwedim Kalipi, and dozens of others. For us, this was a straight pass into the deep heart of the struggle experience. And it was a most amazing learning experience for us. And those people, when you met them, came to personify for me the deep values and universal vision that made the struggle great. So he participated in a whole lot of major things. In 1993, he opened Esikritini, the Robben Island exhibition, which was put in Time magazine. It was a major departure for South African exhibitions, done by Maibuye and the South African Museum. After democracy, he was in the president's office, and he was elected in February 1995 at the big reunion of 1,000 ex-prisoners as chairperson of the Ex-Political Prisoners Association. Soon after that, he was made head of the Future of Robben Island Committee by the cabinet, and he had to report this committee and recommend what should happen to Robben Island in the future. And their recommendations were acted on by the cabinet in September 1985. The committee took more than 170 submissions in making its, before it made its recommendations, and they varied from the bizarre, like put street children and homeless people on Robben Island as a work camp, to business people who wanted opportunities there. And even in the past, it was thought that Robben Island should become a kind of sun city. That was never going to happen with Kathy in charge of working through those proposals. So Cabinet took on his recommendation, virtually unchanged, that Robben Island should be developed as a World Heritage Site, National Monument, and National Museum, which can become a cultural and conservation showcase for the new South African democracy. while at the same time maximizing the economic, tourism, and educational potential of the island. And so that is how Robben Island, we came to be involved, having worked with Kathy in launching Robben Island on the 1st of January, 1997, in record time. It was a moment that, you know, one will remember forever, and it was done in a simple way as well. He's written in his letters and in his many talks how prisoners missed the voices of children, how he first touched a child, I think, after 16 years in prison. And our opening ceremony, throwing open those prison doors after centuries of the place being a place of confinement, was giving the key to an ex-prisoner who'd entered there in chains before to open the doors symbolically with a young child. And that again is the influence of Kathy, small things behind very big moments for us, and one small step more for democratic South Africa. So at RIM, basically, it was a lofty goal to nurture creativity and innovation, contribute to socio-economic development and the transformation of South African society, and the enrichment of humanity. These soaring goals summed up the spirit of those times. And one of the four core essences, besides maintaining the island's symbolism and heritage and keeping it sustainable, was to make Robben Island a platform for critical debate and lifelong learning. And that again is something that we found with Kathy in his many years in prison. And working esecutively during one of the most dramatic moments of the 20th century, not just for South Africa, was truly something that impacted on all our lives. Our goal was to turn a site with a history of indescribable pain into a place of hope for humanity, to open up this closed environment, also figuratively in the sense of minds, to turn it into a place of learning and education, healing and meaning, a place of universalism and inclusivity. That journey to Prague that we've heard about, no doubt contributed to that. And his goal for the island, his quote about what should happen to the island, became the anchor on which the brand was built. If I were to sum up in a sentence our years in prison, I would say, while we will not forget the brutality of apartheid, we will not want Robben Island to be a monument of our hardship and suffering. We would want it to be a monument reflecting the triumph of the human spirit against the forces of evil, a triumph of freedom and human dignity over repression and humiliation, a triumph of wisdom and largeness of spirit against small minds and pettiness, a triumph of courage and determination over human frailty and weakness, a triumph of non-racialism over bigotry and intolerance, a triumph of the new South Africa over the old. There was that broad inclusiveness, that universalism again. And we had a wonderful time starting a whole range of programs on Robben Island. And at the core of these were educational programs for school children. Our first big sponsorship of 3 million was so that we could bring children on subsidized tours. 1/3 of the visitors in the first few months were children already, right from the start. Joint projects with cultural workers and writers and artists. Within 3 months, we had 40 artists in residence living on Robben Island. Joint projects with community groups, including groups working with children. So street children came to Robben Island, but not to do hard labor and be punished, but to draw art and be creative and to be healed on the island in weekend stays. Exhibitions, publishing series, cooperation with local universities, training programs to fast track a new generation of heritage workers in a 3 million Rand heritage training program done with UCT and UWC, the first of its kind, and linkages with relevant international institutions and programs. And so this was the kind of energy and the kind of institution we tried to set up. It was at a time when it wasn't work for us. We believed everything was possible. And it was a kind of attitude of ungadinwa nangomso, don't get tired even tomorrow. It was our date with destiny, and it was driven by the passions, energies, and visions of the time and the struggle and the wisdom of people like Kathy who stood behind it. So we, in no time, had a Robben Island Heritage Memories program. It eventually brought 600 prisoners to Robben Island. We built the Nelson Mandela Gateway building in the waterfront as a signature for Robben Island. Kathy collected fully a third of the 45 million that project cost working with Madiba. We had the National Millennium celebrations on Robben Island. We incorporated the archives of the Maibuya Center. There were fundamental building blocks for the long-term growth of an institution that were put in place. And unfortunately for us, this magnificent start that we had came to a grinding halt around 2001-2003. And that is what we describe in the book as the Robben Island or the rim rupture that happened at that time. And really, it happened, a trigger cause was my management team refusing to bend to pressure for a change in a contract around the ferry in the middle of a 7-year period. A change that would have meant the museum was put in a more negative position, and the outsourced partners would make more money from it. When we did not agree to this, all sorts of things started happening on the island. And we started experiencing some of the things that we saw happening in later years in state capture. Telephone tapping, shady office break-ins, home burglaries, improper use of information from stolen computers, bypassing of institutional processes through appeals to higher authorities, in inverted commas, parallel decision-making structures, the dubious presence of intelligence operatives, disinformation planted in the media, threats to life, and pressure on key officials to resign or else, all became part of a supposedly high-road politics by ex-prisoners to save the island from corruption and mismanagement. Truth and lies, good intentions and behavior, and tactics and pressure that were either questionable, blatantly unethical, or sometimes illegal became mixed up to the detriment of the institution. Politically connected people who proudly described themselves as part of a new patriotic bourgeoisie came to the fore, conflating their own interests with the very real needs of former political prisoners, many of whom were in dire financial straits, but whose problems a sympathetic rim was not mandated or resourced to address. So it became, this kind of draining, toxic environment that we've seen spread into numerous institutions in the last decade or so. And in an attempt to let Robben Island get on with it, I resigned as director in 2002, but things didn't get better. The next target became Kathy himself. This icon of the struggle was now, in slanderous ways, said to have stolen hundreds of millions of rand and was stopping certain people from getting the opportunities that they should from Robben Island, given its history. And also a dirty tricks campaign, which hurt him tremendously. He eventually stepped down as chairperson of the Robben Island Museum Council in late 2006, feeling battered and disrespected, like many other veterans who openly started referring to the old ANC. He then put his energies, of course, and this is why we're sitting here today, into the establishment of the Kathrada Foundation, formed in 2008, which is still working energetically under our chairperson sitting here today. So really the behavior and tactics, it's not the place to go further into the story here. We look at the book at how we try to calmly actually itemize what happened. That the behavior, tactics, and pressures on display at Robben Island Museum in that time comprised, in a real sense, I think, a pilot case for the factionalism and state capture that increasingly came to characterize South African political life during later presidencies. And of course, it's reared its head again during the time of the coronavirus under the current administration. The limping museum, because that's what happened to it, it became injured and has never recovered, in fact, became a precursor of naked political interference and service delivery failures that have today turned several much larger institutions and state-owned enterprises, massive enterprises, into symbols of dysfunctionality. So RIM itself is today in a precarious situation. Some of the tactics that revealed themselves in our time and also under state capture continued under RIM in recent years. And of course, it's no exaggeration to say that, hurt further by the dramatic financial impact of the pandemic, the museum is injured and in deep trouble, far from being the symbol that Kathy wanted it to be of a new South African energy, culture, and values. So I need to end within 3 or 4 minutes. And I think that in our search for answers today, both the museum and the country, we need to look again at the founding values that Kathy and others espoused in our search for answers. Let's look anew again at that generation, at a time when they're being subjected to ridicule. A frail Kathrada indicated at Mandela's funeral in December 2013 that he was handing over the baton with words that speak clearly to RIM and South Africa's current condition. It is up to the present and next generations to take up the cudgels. It is up to them through service to deepen our democracy, entrench and defend our constitution, eradicate poverty, eliminate inequality, fight corruption, and serve always with compassion, respect, integrity, and tolerance. Above all, they must build our nation and break down the barriers that divide us. Such soft words, such strong truths, spoken in such a simple way. Leadership, humility, and the message of a transcending unity. How could we have given up those incredible values based on the sacrifice and struggles of generations? What Kathy asks us here is to live and implement simple but difficult goals that are radical and transformative. What I read him saying is that to be a disciplined revolutionary today, one has to be a humble, decent person who speaks in positive ways, is open to debate and differences, works hard, delivers, stays accountable, and keeps one focused on the values that matter, including entrenching and defending our Constitution. The toughness and discipline of a soldier for freedom are still required, but this time the battle has to be won by being effective in the soft ways of delivery, by checking one's behavior and actions, and by being universal in terms of values and a sense of justice. Far from resorting to a fuzzy moralism stuck in a rainbow past, Kathrada at 85 remained grounded in a struggle, rooted in basic values which seek to free those in society imprisoned by poverty, violence, and prejudice, with the ultimate goal of uplifting the human condition globally. So, as I've said, he invites us to reconnect to values and struggle dreams again. And the key challenge, of course, Chair, is to reverse the fact that the African people remain largely excluded from the socio-economic mainstream in South Africa today. But from Pan-Africanists, Black consciousness followers, nationalists, liberals, humanists, and people of faith to social democrats, democratic socialists, radical social movement activists, Marxists and trade union activists committed to constitutionalism, though informed by notions of class struggle, and anti-globalization campaigners. A wide spectrum of Democrats are able to fit Kathy's basic approach into their political frames of reference. And leadership and unity, guided by clear values, is what is required. I think let me end there and say that let us connect back with our finest traditions of thinking and struggle. And like Mr. K, let us speak up, even at 88 he did it, act and be the agents for the changes our country so desperately needs. Diabulela. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. And I'm hoping that many will get this book, will attend the launches of the book wherever they might be. And at some point, we do hope to have, I think, just a specific discussion with you on this book, as well as the one that's come out together with Peter Hain on the sports struggle as well. As we move to closure, two things. One, we want to say thank you and farewell to one of our long-serving staff members, Busisiwe and Kosi. Busi came to us around 2010, joined us, I think, formally 2011 onwards, and has been with the foundation for the last 10 years. Today, she moves on to another post, and we want to wish her well as she departs from the anti-racism program that she has so ably managed for the last few years. A formal farewell and thank you will be done in the weeks to come. The Kathrada Foundation also produced this particular booklet as a training manual, which we use to train young people on the values of Ahmed Kathrada and use it as a basis to get them started on their journey towards activism. If anybody of you are interested, please contact the foundation and we can organize these training sessions. As we close, I'm going to ask one of our youth club members from Springs, Zahra Msomi, to just talk to us in the next few minutes. What does Uncle Kathy mean to me as a young person? Zahra, over to you. And once you've done, we would conclude today's proceedings. Thank you. Over to you.
All right. Good afternoon to our distinguished guests. I hope I'm audible. Am I audible, Uncle Mishan? Right.
Yes, you are.
Good afternoon to our distinguished guests, our wonderful presenter, and our brilliant audience. My name is Zahara Msomi, and as Uncle Mishan mentioned, I am part of the Ahmed Kathrada Youth Club. And I'm really honored today to be a part of this discussion and to speak amongst legends and amongst powerful beings that have spoken here today. And I will be eternally grateful for the opportunity that has been provided to me today. I have been asked to speak about what does Uncle Kathy mean to me as a young South African. And I remember quite well the first time that I met Uncle Kathy, and it was in the pages of my grade 4 history textbook, a book that was half my size at the time, but one with incredibly necessary content for youngsters like myself, who had the most fertile mental grounds to plant the seeds of change and of activism in our lives. And over the years, such seeds have been watered and inspired to grow by legends like Uncle Kathy, who have unlocked within ourselves a passion for activism. I am currently 20 years old, and I think that it's quite wonderful to see how Uncle Kathy began his activism at an earlier stage than me, at a very young and tender stage. And the juxtaposition between Uncle Kathy and myself and many youngsters in South Africa today is quite clear. It's that this young South African, who with a few taps on her phone, will have access to unlimited materials that can conscientize me, that can educate me, be it about politics, be it about the law, be it about anything that is socially centered. While on the other hand of the spectrum, Uncle Kathy and his peers and many other young South Africans that lived back then lived in a time where there was deliberate censoring courtesy of the apartheid government, where books such as I Write What I Like by Steve Biko and books such as The Threefold Chord by Alex Leguma and multiple other books were banned during their time. And despite such challenges that they faced, and only having access to a limited number of books, the youth were not defeated, nor were they shaken in any way, because as we can see right now, we see them emerging in history as these, as the greatest beings who have ever existed in our world. Which then leaves me and other young people in this country with the question that if they could do what they could do with the very limited resources that they had, what is it that we could possibly do with the multiple resources that we do have accessible to us? And we can ask ourselves, if they did it, why can't I? Because we are just as human as Uncle Kathy was, with flesh, with blood, and with beating hearts. We are no different from his creation. He too walked, he too talked, he too loved, and he too lived. And since we are all able of doing so, then we are capable of doing so much more and effecting change within our society as well. Uncle Kathy reminds all of us to question and to challenge all systems that disadvantage many and favor a few. He reminds us that even when young, you get to be an impactful human being, that it is in your youthdom where you create a version of yourself that will define you for eternity. It is in your youthdom where you must begin your legacy, and your service must always be for and to the people, because in the revolution, there is no space, there's no place for selfish ambition, goals, and gains. There is always place for change. And we see this from Uncle Kathy, that even when he was 25 years old, he was banned from 39 political organizations, even more than his age. And he reminds us that as young people, we need to ensure that we are actively involved in our communities, in our country, in creating the country and creating the world that we so wish to live in. I think another really beautiful thing about Uncle Kathy is that after spending 26 years in prison, he did not put down the weapons that he used to fight against oppressive systems. Still, even in our democracy, he continued to wage war and become an active combatant against systems that disenfranchised the many. And the lesson that we can all draw from this is how virtuous and principled Uncle Kathy was, and how he continued, even in his advanced age, to be rooted in his ethics. And I would now like to read a very important letter that Uncle Kathy wrote, that he addressed to the youth of South Africa back in 1954 when he was banned. And he says that, to the youth of South Africa, the days ahead of us will be dark, and there will be many ups and downs in our struggle. It is for these dark days that we must prepare, for many a comrade must begin to feel disillusioned, hopeless, and helpless. Some will lose confidence in our struggle and fall by the wayside. You must always remember that the cause of freedom is just and invincible, that there's no such thing as defeat. Remember, no struggle in any part of the world was won in the drawing rooms and in conference tables. We must at all times know that as with the struggles of all peoples, the main brunt will have to be borne by the youth. We expect you and each and everyone to play your part in whatever you do, sports, social, economic, and cultural. And the ending sentence that he says in this letter is, remember the struggle. For me, this is more than just a letter. It's an affirmation. It's a reminder to the youth of South Africa of then and of now as well to continue in the struggles and fighting injustices that we find ourselves living in today. But most importantly, the voice that I get from this letter is for us to be brave, to be brave. This is what his life says to me and reminds me to be, because everything starts with the little effort of being brave. You, an entity against the sea of injustice, requires for you to be brave. You, as a human being, as little and as small as you think of yourself to be brave enough to fight and to unleash all of your might. You might just find that the passion and the love that resides within you is more powerful than any adversity that you have ever faced. So be brave. In conclusion, I do not like to think of Uncle Kathy as a lifelong activist because that infers that he has died. Well, I believe that he may have died in flesh, but in spirit, he's still with us. He hasn't died. He hasn't died, not when I see that there are many of us today who emulate his life, who embody his values and who continue his legacy. And just like Uncle Ronnie mentioned earlier on, he's very much alive in all of us. And today I got to meet Uncle Kathy again, and it was beautiful. So thank you so much to everyone's contributions in helping us today learn more about a man who should never just remain in the archives of history, but should continue living within all of us today. Thank you very much.
Zara, thank you so much. A powerful closure. Greetings to everybody. And we hope to see you soon as we can organize the first public event of the foundation. I'm sure that all of you will be there. So thank you once more for joining us. Thanks to the SABC and others for flighting this live. And thanks to the friends of the foundation from different parts of the world who've also joined in here today. Please be safe. COVID is still with us. But as I think Zara has indicated, there is a lot of work still to be done. Thank you. Be safe. Bye.